On June 1st, Ukrainian forces carried out an attack that not only struck the Russian psyche, but also hit Russia's strategic capability, targeting valuable and vital nuclear bombers deep within Russian territory. For this, the Ukrainians used already known drones and other experimental ones. This is something important because, despite the increasingly clear Russian victory, the Ukrainians have lost most of their agricultural territory, most of their industrial hub. They are lacking energy and being extorted by the United States. But in the midst of so many difficulties, they have managed to stand out in their capacity for industrial, military, and strategic innovation. In fact, the Ukrainians, together with the Russians, are the only armed forces on the planet today that are prepared for the true war of the 21st century with extensive use of drones and artificial intelligence. We have already seen here on the channel a video talking about the industrial military comparison between Europe and Russia, but today we are going to look at the Ukrainian case and its military industrial capacity, which will probably be the backbone of the country's economic recovery and a reference for many countries for decades. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know to help the Geopolitica Mundial channel keep growing. Your support is very important. And if you like this kind of strategic analysis and intelligence content, consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, you not only get early access to videos and access to exclusive videos, but you also help ensure that the Geopolitica Mundial channel can focus on its essence without having to worry about the number of views, especially because the channel is shadow banned on YouTube, so your support is essential. I'm Adriano Peda, and you're watching Geopolitica Mundial. It's vital to understand Ukraine's industrial response to the Russian invasion, because it's a country that lost most of its industrial hub and had to quickly adapt in the midst of war and a lack of various resources, including human resources. Just relying on the delivery of weapons and supplies from Europeans and Americans was not an option, because not only did they take a long time, but also when many things were finally sent, they were either already obsolete or literally unusable due to age, which forced Ukrainians to resort to creativity. But for that, we need to look at the condition of Ukrainian defense companies before the invasion, marked both by a very large potential capacity and by a process of decline mainly caused by systemic corruption. In 1991, a very large part of the Soviet military-industrial complex was located in Ukraine, with 3,594 companies and scientific organizations producing military and dual-use products, focusing both on the civilian and military markets, with a total of about 3 million employees. Almost 700 of these companies, including 205 industrial associations and 139 scientific industrial organizations, directly employed about 1,450,000 people in the production of military items. Ukrainian scientific research institutions were involved in much of the fundamental and applied scientific research of the Soviet Union in the area of security and defense. Ukraine produced intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ICBMs, cruiser ships and aircraft carriers, cargo planes, main battle tanks, air-to-air missiles, anti-tank missile complexes, and a long list of other high-tech weapons and military equipment for that time. However, the number of Ukrainian defense-oriented companies dropped rapidly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and by 1993, the number of defense-related factories had decreased by more than 50%, followed by a massive reduction in orders. Soon, Ukraine not only stopped buying new weapons for a while, but also became the target of forced demilitarization, during which weapons and military equipment were destroyed or even transferred to Russia with the support of Western partners. As has already been widely reported by various Portuguese language channels, Ukraine gave up 176 ICBMs, about 2,000 strategic nuclear warheads, and approximately 4,000 tactical nuclear warheads. But there are some caveats to this because Ukraine inherited the warheads but did not have full control over them for three main reasons. The first is that the command and control systems remained under Moscow's control. The nuclear warheads were installed on missiles like the SS-18 and SS-19, but the activation codes, the command infrastructure, and the authorization systems were centralized in Moscow. And without access to that system, Ukraine couldn't launch the missiles, even if it wanted to. Second, most of the warheads were separated from the delivery systems because after independence, a large part of the warheads was removed from the missiles and stored in bunkers, and the process of technical maintenance and monitoring still depended on Russia. Ukraine didn't have independent infrastructure to keep those warheads operational in the long term. And third, the lack of a nuclear doctrine and its own chain of command meant that Ukraine never developed a strategic doctrine for the use of nuclear weapons, nor did it establish a national command and control system to replace the Soviet mechanisms. In practice, it was an involuntary nuclear power. So, contrary to what is often said, it's not as if by handing the warheads back to Russia, they made a strategic mistake because in practice they didn't have the means to use them. And even if they use the material from those warheads for dirty bombs, they already have technology in their own nuclear plants to produce that kind of material. So, don't blame the Ukrainians for having returned the nuclear weapons. But the demilitarization also affected conventional weapons, for example, as part of the program in one place. At the end of the 1990s, Ukraine transferred part of its fleet of strategic bombers back to Russia. 8 Tu-160 bombers, 3 Tu-95S, and 19 Tu-22s. Russia also received 581 Kh-55 cruise missiles with a range of 2,500 to 3,500 kilometers and 386 missiles with a range of up to 600 kilometers. Ironically, it was some of these strategic bombers that the Ukrainians have now destroyed in Russia. To understand the importance of the Ukrainian contribution, it's worth noting that, according to expert estimates, Russia currently has at most 60 Tu-22s, of which only half are in combat-ready condition. Between the mid-1990s and the early 2000s, Ukraine was also forced to destroy 60 units of the Tu-22 of various modifications, 9 Tu-160s, 21 Tu-95s, and 487 Kh-55 missiles. And to fulfill disarmament commitments, with the United States, 132 mobile tactical missile complexes with a range of up to 300 kilometers and 185 ballistic missiles were deactivated. In 2012, the S-200 anti-aircraft defense systems with a range of up to 250 kilometers were retired from service. Under its cooperation with NATO, Ukraine also carried out the systematic destruction of its own stockpile of conventional munitions, small arms, and even personal weapons. Since 2006, 133,000 tons of munitions, 1,000 man-portable anti-aircraft missile systems, and 1.5 million units of small arms have been destroyed under NATO's Partnership for Peace and its clauses on the destruction of surplus ammunition. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army was also severely weakened. The defense industry lost the large domestic orders that previously sustained its capacity. The inherited industry began to focus on maintaining and extending the lifespan of equipment inherited from the Soviet Union, with investments aimed at modernization rather than replacement. For most Ukrainian defense companies, the only way to survive was to seek foreign clients interested in Soviet-origin weapons. Ukraine quickly became one of the world's largest arms exporters, whether through legitimate and legal sales or on the black market, even achieving success in direct competition with Russia. An example of its competitiveness was the contract to supply 320 T-80 tanks to Pakistan between 1996 and 1999. To fulfill the order, the Malyshev factory increased its production to 110 tanks per year, and even so, this was only a fraction of its total capacity, which was 900 units per year. At that time, the entire budget of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine allowed for the purchase of only a few dozen tanks per year. But after the Soviet collapse, the number of workers in the defense industry dropped very quickly, while approximately 95% of total production was destined for export. Until 2014, a significant portion of these exports was still directed to Russia, which was never able to fully replace Ukrainian components. And even after the beginning of the Russian annexation in 2014, when Ukraine stopped technical military cooperation with Moscow, Russia remained dependent on certain essential Ukrainian components. The engines from Motor 6 for Russian helicopters and airplanes stand out, as well as the gas turbine engines produced by Zorya Mashprukt in Mykolaiv for Russian warships. In addition, Ukraine refused to continue providing support for the Russian intercontinental missile systems SS-18 Satan and SS-19 Stiletto, whose control system was developed in Kharkiv by the company Hartron. Some experts believe that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is partly due to Russia's need to regain control over the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. But at the same time, Russia's need to buy products from the Ukrainian defense industry was one of the factors that allowed this industry to survive until 2014, and the Russian pressure that began that year ended up becoming a boost for its further development. After the Russian annexation of Crimea and then Donbass, Ukraine faced a de facto embargo on purchases of Western weapons, which lasted in different forms until 2018 when the United States government finally approved the export of lethal weaponry to Ukraine. Under these conditions, the Ukrainian defense industry became practically the only source of strengthening of the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces, just as happened with Russia after 2022. Ukraine's initial focus was not on producing new systems, but rather on restoring and modernizing equipment that had been stored for long periods. In the following years, the main priorities of Ukraine's defense industry became replacing the Russian components needed to maintain existing weaponry and at the same time promoting rearmament based on the development of new systems. At the beginning of 2021, Ukraine had managed to replace at least half of all Russian components and had begun serial production of several systems that would go on to demonstrate high effectiveness during the large-scale invasion. Among these, the Neptune anti-ship missile system, the Bogdan self-propelled howitzer, and the Bukovyl electronic warfare system stand out. Even so, Ukraine remained dependent on acquiring certain components from the international market or even from Russia itself. Before Russia's 2022 invasion, Ukraine's defense industry had over 300 companies, institutions, and organizations developing and producing weapons and military equipment. The total number of workers in the sector exceeded 250,000 people, with most of these companies being state-owned, mainly managed by the state corporation Ukroboronprom, which included 118 of the largest companies in the sector. These companies operated in areas such as aircraft construction and repair, production of high-precision weaponry and ammunition, production and maintenance of armored vehicles, production of radar systems, electronic warfare, and communications and shipbuilding. Ukraine did not implement a formal industrial mobilization. The portion of the Ukrainian budget allocated to the development of the defense industrial complex and the expansion of production capacity was much more modest than that of Russia. In 2022, only $60 million were allocated for these purposes, a figure that rose to $300 million in 2023 and $1.2 billion in 2024. These resources alone were insufficient to create solid industries from scratch or to encourage an autonomous private sector. But since the country already had large state-controlled companies, the funds could be used directly to restart production. The existence of hundreds of thousands of engineers and skilled workers whose livelihoods were previously supported by defense exports was extremely important. In addition, thanks to the Soviet legacy, they had several already established industrial parks that were abandoned, which could then be reactivated. After all, One thing that many people don't understand is that transferring industries from a civilian focus to a military focus is something very difficult. But transferring from a military focus to a civilian one and then returning to military is much easier. This allowed immediate maintenance to be provided to the armed forces, both for their own equipment and for captured equipment that had been abandoned by the Russians. And it also made maintenance of Western weaponry possible. In addition to the increase in domestic production of ammunition and various weapons, despite modest investments, Ukraine managed to significantly increase weapon production in existing factories and even launch new weapons during the first 2.5 years of the war. Ukraine's weapons and military equipment production tripled in 2023. In fall 2022, Ukraine started producing 152mm artillery shells for the first time. And in September 2024, Ukraine revealed that it had also started producing 155mm shells used by NATO artillery systems. This was only possible thanks to the license granted by the Norwegian government and the transfer of machinery by another allied country. By October 2024, 1 out of every 2 munitions used by Ukrainians in combat zones had been manufactured in Ukraine itself. While Europe, after announcing a bold expansion and record investments in its military-industrial complex, made absolutely no progress in 3 years, the Ukrainians, with far fewer resources and conditions, advanced a lot. Ukrainian-produced munitions are significantly cheaper than those on the international market. PASUP, NATO purchases 155mm shells for $4,000 to $8,000 each, whereas those made in Ukraine cost around $1,500 per shell. Although Ukraine still faces very big challenges in scaling up the production of propellant charges, just like in Europe, Ukraine has also been running several parallel defense programs, including the development of ballistic missiles and a variety of jet-powered one-way attack drones, as well as cruise missiles, although the current production of these systems is still small. The expectation is that it will grow a lot more in 2025 if the Russians don't destroy their industrial park, which is unlikely. That's because in 2022 and 2023, the Russians mistakenly tried to spare the buildings of the Ukrainian military industry, most likely because they thought about using them in the future. When they realized it was unfeasible for 2023 and 2024, it was too late. Because with that window of time, the Ukrainians not only expanded production, but also spread them out in secret locations. To locate the military production centers, the Russian secret services actively exploited flaws in Ukrainian public records, flaws that allowed them to identify the addresses of industrial facilities, as well as the names of managers and owners. To reduce this vulnerability since the early days of the invasion, Ukraine adopted a dispersion strategy, organizing the production process in a way that avoids concentrating large volumes of products or components in a single location. There was a major debate in the Ukrainian government at the time regarding moving industrial facilities to fortified and underground locations. Initially, dispersion was used to reduce production disruptions. However, as Russian attacks intensified in 2024, this strategy was reconsidered. The Ukrainian government began actively investing in the construction of protected sites for weapons manufacturing. Although UCRO Barampron and their subsidiaries have succeeded in expanding the production of critical weapons systems and developing complex armaments, the concentration of the defense industry under state ownership has been criticized internally. The main criticism is that the government is unable to adequately invest in emerging technologies, such as drones, to enable their full development. In 2022, when it became clear that drones would be a transformative capability for reconnaissance and attack, Ukraine also discovered that the international market could not supply robust drones in sufficient quantity. Thus, an ecosystem of Ukrainian domestic drone manufacturing emerged. Today, this ecosystem is made up of more than 120 companies and can be divided into 3 major categories. In the first layer, there are companies with the technical capability to design and produce highly effective drones, as well as adapt them for environments with active electronic warfare. There are fewer than 15, and many have direct connections with specific units of the armed forces, which allows for rapid testing, evaluation, and improvements. In the second layer, there are companies that design and produce simple drones with moderate effectiveness, and they are also able to manufacture designs developed by the companies in the first layer. In the third layer, there are companies that only replicate successful simple models, but they do not have the capacity for their own development. This category represents the majority. Now, there is a caveat, because the development of drones has been fundamental for the Ukrainians to withstand the Russian forces. It is thanks to private initiative which has led and spearheaded the production, development, and innovation of Ukrainian drones. This large number of players allows for a very rapid adaptation cycle, but it also creates inefficiencies in production scale, with high indirect costs due to fragmentation. Despite this, Ukraine's drone production increased steadily, reaching over 100,000 drones of various types per month by 2024. Although the drone sector is the most publicized, it is not the only example of private innovation in Ukrainian defense. Another relevant example is the Sky Fortress system, the backbone of distributed air defense. It uses microphones spread across Ukrainian territory to capture the acoustic signature of aerial targets and, through real-time algorithmic analysis, enables live tracking and coordination of air defense units. The development and deployment of Sky Fortress cost about $5 million, a pathetically small amount given its high efficiency. Its growth was enabled by utilizing commercial sensors and parts, permitting rapid and affordable upkeep. Private companies also began to work in the production of conventional military systems, including armored vehicles, artillery systems, and even missiles, making it clear that Ukraine's great ability to respond is due to the Ukrainian private sector, with the government being less efficient when managing, but more efficient at coordinating the efforts of the private sector. By 2024, the Ukrainian defense industrial complex, including both state-owned and private companies, consisted of 500 companies and employed 300,000 people, becoming one of the pillars of the national economy. In 2023, out of Ukraine's gross domestic product growth of 4.9%, 1.5 percentage points came directly from the defense industry. However, the shortage of resources and corruption continue to be the main problems. Out of the $40 billion in Ukraine's defense budget for 2024, $30 billion were allocated to salaries and various payments to military personnel, and only $6 billion to the purchase of armaments. Now, the operation of this Ukrainian defense industry will be vital to ensure jobs and a minimum of economic stability in case there is a ceasefire or a pause in intense fighting, or even if Ukraine continues to exist, because this industry will be the economic backbone of the future Ukraine. Depending on the context, putting Ukraine in the top category of arms exporters when the conflict ends. Anyway, we'll keep following it. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, and follow us on our other networks, Telegram and Instagram, to stay up to date with the channel's news and geopolitics. Hugs, and see you in the next video.